Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Constitutional Chats with Janine Turner. That's me, Cathy Gillespie, Tova Love Kaplan, and Dakare Chatman. Today, we are going to read the Declaration of Independence. Gather everyone around and let's read the most important document along with the United States Constitution in our country's history, as well as perhaps the world. Okay, here we go. The Declaration of Independence. The unanimous declaration of 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, invents a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, with the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new approbations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation.
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses,
for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation.
He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement. We've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are abolished from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection with them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It was signed by President of Congress, John Hancock.
New Hampshire signers, Josiah Bartlett, William Whipple, Matthew Thornton.
Massachusetts Bay signers, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Payne, Elbridge Gary.
Rhode Island and Providence plantation signers, Stephen Hopkins and William Ellery.
Connecticut signers, Roger Sherman, Samuel Huntington, William Williams, Oliver Wolcott.
New York signers, William Floyd, Philip Livingston, Francis Lewis, and Lewis Morris.
New Jersey signers, Richard Stockton, John Witherspoon, Francis Hopkinson, John Hart, Abraham Clark.
Pennsylvania signers, Robert Morris, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, John Morton, George Clymer, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson, and George Ross.
Delaware signers, Caesar Rodney, George Reed, Thomas McKeon.
Maryland signers, Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone, Charles Carroll.
Virginia signers, George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Nelson Jr., Francis Lightfoot Lee, Carter Braxton.
North Carolina signers, William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, and John Penn.
South Carolina signers, Edward Rutledge, Thomas Hayward Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., Arthur Middleton.
And Georgia signers, Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton.
The Declaration of Independence, everybody. Woo! I know our founding fathers were watching from heaven. Absolutely. There you have it, everyone, the reading of the Declaration of Independence. So now I'm going to do an official hello. I'm not going to read all the bios today, though, but I'm Janine Turner. I'm an actress. You can go to JanineTurner.com to check all that out. I'm founder and co-president of Constituting America with Cathy Gillespie, who is co-president. Super awesome. We're the two wings of the eagle. I couldn't do anything without her. Tova Love Kaplan, our extraordinary 16-year-old National Youth Director of Constituting America, and Dakare Chatman, the oh so fabulous Constituting America Ambassador, and they're winners of our contest. And they are equal in this process of prepping, preparing, choosing guests. As they ask their own questions, they are truly the future of our country, and you should feel very, very hopeful and excited about the future of our country with the two of them. We have another fabulous millennial, Lisa Williams, who is our director of media and edits everything that we have on this show, and she's brilliant, puts this all together. And Jeanette Cranack. Jeanette Cranack is our director of, what do we call it? Operations? Is that what you are? Yes, director of operations. And if you want to book a speech, If you want to book any type of civic organization with Constituting America, we've done over about 600 of them now. You can push that speech button and out our website under the George Washington Speaking Initiative and book a speech and speak with Jeanette. Okay, now I believe Dakare is going to introduce Mr. Williams.
Yes, and we are so glad to have Mr. Tony Williams. But before I introduce him, I would like to give a shout out to our generous sponsor of this constitutional chat, Mrs. Cindy Clark from Hawaii, who has been supporting CA since our first year in 2010. So thank you, Miss Cindy Clark from Hawaii. I wish I was in Hawaii, where you are, enjoying the sun, rays, and the beach of Hawaii. But on to our constitutional chat today. Today we have Mr. Tony Williams. He is a senior teaching fellow. He is an accomplished scholar, author, and educator. He loves sharing his passion for the ideas and documents of the American founding with teachers across the country, while also writing history and civics curricula for the Institute. He taught middle and high school for 15 years before becoming the program director at the Washington, Jefferson, and Madison Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia. He is the author of 5 phenomenal books, I'm sure, on early American history, including the most recent with Stephen F. Knott, Washington and Hamilton, the alliance that forged America. And his other books include The Jamestown Experiment in 2011, America's Beginning in 2010, Pax and Covenant in 2010, Hurricane of the Independence in 2008, and Hamilton in 2018. His Washington and Hamilton was nominated for a Washington Book Prize and a Library of Virginia Nonfiction Award. He lectures around the country with C-SPAN, Book TV, Fox News, Legends and Lies, The Patriots, the U.S. State Department, Revolutionary War battle sites, Colonial Williamsburg, the Virginia Festival of the Book, and several universities. And he has a BA in history from Syracuse University and a master's in U.S. history from Ohio State University. And he lives with his wife and children in Williamsburg. So thank you, Mr. Tony Williams, for being here for the second time on our Constitutional Chat series. And we're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Dakare. That was a very nice introduction, a mouthful, but yeah, very, very kind of you. And I think that right now we're going to have an opportunity to say a few words by introduction about the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's important to note right away that, you know, it's such a critically important document, as Janine said earlier, to the American soul even. It's what Lincoln said was the standard maxim of a free society. And he also called it, in Lincoln's eyes, it was, to use biblical imagery, an apple of gold in the picture of silver, which is the Constitution. He saw these two documents as really intertwined, but the Declaration being the apple of gold, really the center piece of the American experiment in liberty and self-government, and the Constitution, the framework of government around that apple of gold, as he described the Declaration. The document itself was heavily influenced by many different traditions, but most notably by the ideas of John Locke, who was an Enlightenment philosopher. And he wrote these treatises of government, which really helped influence Jefferson and the other members of the Continental Congress in their thinking about government. But they really pulled not only from Locke, from the Enlightenment, they pulled their ideas about government and human nature from the Bible, from the ancient tradition, from the English tradition. A lot of different sources went into building and creating that startlingly original document. So those principles include, as we read earlier, we start with the idea of equality, right? The equality of all human beings and their humanity, the equality of all human beings and their dignity, but most especially in their rights, in their natural rights, right? And in their equal consent to the government, and in their equality under the law, right? There's many facets of this equality, but most notably in our rights, in our natural rights, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. And these natural rights come from the Creator, right? They don't come from an earthly source. They come from, as Jefferson said, nature and nature's God, from the Creator. And so we have these equal natural rights, and they cannot be taken away by government, by our fellow citizens. They are inalienable, right? We cannot be alienated or separated from our rights. And those natural rights include liberty, of course, right? The idea of our individual rights, our individual civil and religious liberty. And this liberty is rooted in natural law. So it's not that we can do whatever we want to, but we have the right to determine our own destiny and to live freely. And like I said, to enjoy our individual civil and religious liberty. And this automatically limits government, right? Which is another principle of the Declaration. It's based upon, rooted upon limited government, and it also limits our other fellow citizens from violating those rights. And the Declaration does something very important flowing from that, right? It all kind of logically connects in this flow. That the purpose of government, right, is to protect our natural rights. To protect those civil and religious liberties and those natural rights, right? And the idea of government, Republican government, self-government, democratic government, is not only to protect those rights, but is rooted, is predicated upon the idea of consent, that we give consent to the government, to our representatives, to rule for us, okay? And the idea is that they're going to be protecting our rights. If that government, as Jefferson says, starts to violate those rights, then as a last resort, after we've tried everything else, petitioning and contacting our representatives and speaking freely about the abuses, if a government has a long train of abuses, not just one or two laws they don't like, if it becomes tyrannical, then the people as a whole have a right to overthrow that government, but they must also institute new government that shall better conduce to their safety and happiness. In other words, a government, a self-government, a republic that will in fact fulfill its purpose of protecting those rights. So that's just a quick overview of the Declaration in 5 minutes, but I hope it lays out some of the really critically important principles in that document, and they're really principles of the American experiment.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Williams, thank you so much. And you have a book coming out on the Declaration of Independence. I know that was read there in the bio, but I think we should, when is your book going to be released?
I'm looking at, not for a while, I'm looking at finishing it by 2022 for the 4th of July, and I'm working on it. And it's really interesting because it looks at the Declaration of Independence itself and its principles and its creation, but it also looks at the document throughout history and how it's been contested and how it's been understood and how it's been viewed by a lot of different people, from the women at Seneca Falls who wanted to vote because of the ideals of the Declaration, all the way up through Lincoln and Martin Luther King when he had the I Have a Dream speech. So it's a really interesting book looking throughout American history and how Americans understood that document.
Well, we look forward to that. That'll be here before you know it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I have modern day aspects I wanted to discuss with this, but before you know, I'll do that in my next round of questioning, I guess. But I think what people have lost it today, because it's hundreds of years later, is the actual courage it took for these men to say this. How unique it was in principle, how, you know, ordained it was, so to speak, but how courageous they were to say, we are dissolving our bands with you, the most powerful country in the world. And we can look back now and say, by, you know, however you want to say it, brilliance, divine intervention, whatever it might be, that we won the war and that we have the Constitution, that this experiment has lasted. But they didn't know then. That's why with the end here, where it says our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor, some actually did lose their lives. They did lose their fortunes. Some wives and family members. It wasn't just happy-go-lucky because we won the war. And I think what's lost here and very hard to explain is the magnanimity of, is that a word? Of this situation, and how brave they were. And how because John Adams insisted on this document, and then George Washington read it to the troops, how unifying it was to the country. And if you parlay that into today, where there seems to be so much division, or even during the Civil War, where, it's interesting that there were Tories back then. There were people who were not in alliance with this Declaration of Independence, and yet there was enough unity to fight the war. It's really interesting, because you would think would need complete unity to accomplish something like this, but they didn't have complete unity back then. There were quite a few enemies, which is why when they were freezing to death, tell me the name.
Valley Forge.
That's it. Valley Forge. At Valley Forge, it was astonishing when I read the book on George Washington, which I think everybody should read, by Ron Chernow, that they were freezing to death and starving to death, and just within view was a village with food, but they were Tories and wouldn't give them any. It's just really unbelievable. So I don't know. It's so complicated. But mainly, my question to you is the unity that they had, the amount of unity that they had to accomplish what they needed, because everyone was not behind them, and also how magnanimous this was, and how brave they were to do it, and how people did suffer and die for it, of course, in the war. But just for signing it, they thought they would be hanged.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And the courage, I think, is on many levels. One is, yes, this was a treasonable offense, writing this and splitting off. And they knew that they had to have physical courage to go to war. I mean, they were already at war, right, with the world's largest empire and one of the most powerful militaries. But it also took, as you said, other kinds of courage of losing, your home and your property to the war, and the courage of splitting off from Great Britain, right? We had been very prosperous under the British. We had the protection of the Navy with our trade. There were a lot of benefits from being part of the British Empire, and we were going to surrender those when we split. And so I do think this bravery and to declare this Republican government, it was also very brave, because very few republics had existed in history in a world of monarchy and tyranny. And so splitting off in this new experiment in liberty was really quite bold and quite daring. And what was the other part of your question?
To have done it amongst colonies that weren't completely unanimous in this respect.
I mean, we weren't completely unified, right? John Dickinson even really opposed the Declaration. So even within Congress itself, there were those who did not want to split off. Gouverneur Morris and others, Robert Morris, some very skeptical of independence, because we were going to give up all of those benefits. They thought that maybe we can still reconcile, maybe our problems with Britain could still be resolved. That was in the end not true. But sure, I mean, there were many Tories among the citizenry. There were those who were skeptical of independence in Congress and in the other legislative halls around the different colonies. And so there's not perfect unanimity. And you know what, that's okay, because that's what Republican self-government is all about. It's about deliberation. It's about reaching a consensus. It's about compromise. It's about magnanimity. It's about all those virtues that you were mentioning. All that goes into deliberating whether we should split off, right? It wasn't just the will or act of a king or queen, of a monarch that causes separation. It was the deliberative will of the people and their representatives. And so I think that disunity in many ways is very representative of who we are as a people, because it represents a deliberative process of coming to a decision.
You know, I've never really thought about that in regard to that, we made this Declaration of Independence that we were splitting from the most powerful country in the world, but that as a Republican form of government.
Right.
You know, that's a really interesting kind of piece of the puzzle to ponder, is that we weren't splitting off with a king.
Right.
It wasn't one, all the other wars have been, you know, the King of Spain against the King of England or whatever. We were splitting off as a republic, which is truly, I haven't thought about that very often. I want to move on so other people can ask questions, but what's something I do want to throw out there is that the Declaration of Independence had to be unanimous. Everyone had to say yes.
Right. In the Congress,
right?
Yep. In the Congress.
Yeah.
There we go.
Where they were writing the Declaration of Independence, they all had to say yes, or they would not be able to. They had to be unanimous, which became a problem later with the Articles of Confederation, all this. But don't forget to watch the musical 1776. Dakare and Tova, have y'all seen it yet? Have y'all seen it? Okay, be sure to watch it because it is amazing. All right, I know Tova and Dakare and Cathy all want to ask questions, and I think Jeanette should throw one in here today, and Lisa, since they didn't get their formal introduction. Tova, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing that I found really interesting about the Declaration of Independence is its lasting impact, not just on America, but on other countries as well, because I remember learning about how the Declaration of Independence's language has been either directly copied or echoed in so many other, you know, constitutions and declarations of independence worldwide, from a diverse range of countries, from Argentina to, you know, Vietnam to, you know, New Zealand, like all these different countries that have really viewed this language and found something that they could connect to, not just America, but as a people, as, you know, humanity. So what aspects of this Declaration of Independence do you think is so enduring and so unique? Because it's not like, you know, John Locke wrote a lot of stuff, but people aren't that many countries aren't necessarily copying and pasting his language, you know, his exact words into their declarations of independence, but they're taking our words, you know, from our Declaration of Independence. So what do you think makes it unique? What do you think makes it that inspirational and enduring that people all over the world for centuries have looked to it as kind of a, you know, a guiding force?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially from a future international relations student. I think you're absolutely right. First of all, that a lot of countries have appealed to it, and a lot of people have appealed to it, and I think it's for a couple of very simple reasons. One is these principles that I talked about: equality, liberty, self-government, consent. All of these ideas of a natural rights republic really appeal to human nature, right? It's a statement about human nature. It's very aspirational. Of course, we'll probably come back to this at some point. We know that it didn't immediately apply to all people, but not everyone enjoyed those rights right away. But it was a universal statement that people do have those rights by nature, and that's something that I think all human beings across the globe want, because of human nature. You know, they want to govern themselves. They don't want to be ruled by a tyrant or even a king. They want to have liberty and rule themselves according to their own consent. And so these universal ideals have become very aspirational for peoples around the globe. And also, I think, because they're true principles, right? They're not just limited by time and space. It's not like they applied in 1776 but don't apply today in 2020, or that they only apply here but not in other parts around the world, right? So they're true principles that apply to all peoples at all times and create an aspirational quality in appealing to those rights. So I think that a lot of people have been drawn to them for those reasons.
I want to make sure everyone gets their question in. Dakare?
I guess Tova and I kind of had the same things on our mind, because my question was kind of in the same regard, and it was, the Declaration of Independence, we see it copied, like Tova was saying, and my question was hers. So I guess I don't have a question. It was basically like, what's the catch? Kind of like, why is everyone wanting to use what we use?
Right.
Can you explain that?
Well, let me give you an answer here in America, similar to that question. It's not only been appealed to by people around the world, right, which was Tova's question, but here in the United States as well. So when the women of Seneca Falls met in 1848, and some men like Frederick Douglass, when they appealed to rights for women, especially women's suffrage, they copied their Declaration of Sentiments was a copy of the Declaration of Independence, just reworded slightly. They said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." Right? That document was appealed to by Lincoln when it was being denied by the pro-slavery advocates, and when he wrote his Gettysburg Address. It was appealed to by Martin Luther King and by men like Frederick Douglass when they were arguing for African American equality. So this appeal to the Declaration and its universal principles and its truths has not only been a worldwide phenomenon, but very importantly been an aspirational set of ideals for all Americans throughout our own history as well.
Thank you. Okay, Cathy.
Well, Tony, I think you've alluded a little bit to this, but we have an audience question. Paula Jones asks, when the Declaration of Independence was written, the institution of slavery still existed. How do you teach students that the Declaration of Independence was a document that included all people?
Right. Well, I think it's an inevitable question. I think it's one we need to confront head on. And I also think that that's a very big question. And I'm just going to give you probably an abbreviated form. As I show in one of the chapters in my book, the Declaration of Independence, very few people had questioned slavery before this document. Okay, many Quakers had, and a few others, but that was about it. Once the Declaration of Independence is written, slavery becomes an institution that's understood to have violated every single principle that I mentioned, right? It violates natural rights, it violates equality and equal dignity and equality under the law and equal consent, it violates liberty, it violates the very purposes of government with consent and so forth. And so it violates all those Republican or Democratic principles. But I think there's some good news in there that the document led to the greatest emancipation in world history up to that time. People saw the contradiction of those revolutionary ideals in the Declaration and the institution of slavery. Upwards of 100,000 slaves were freed after the Declaration of Independence. This was done in a few different ways. One was through private manumission. People privately freed their slaves because they recognized that contradiction. Several states in the North either outright freed their slaves or gradually did it as well. And it informed documents like the Northwest Ordinance that banned slavery in those Western states in the Northwest Territory. Now, tragically, slavery was not ended for complex reasons. And so it endured, and it even spread to some states out west, especially in the southern part of the country. But I do need to think we need to recognize that the Declaration, I think, was really one of the world's most important anti-slavery documents, and yet it wasn't able to achieve everything. But in abolishing slavery eventually, the abolitionists, Abraham Lincoln, and other people who fought for the abolition of slavery consistently referred back to this document. Why? Because it has those anti-slavery principles built into the very fabric of the document. Anyway, it's a much more complex issue than that, but I hope that suffices for at least a few basic ideas dealing with the Declaration and slavery.
Yeah, I think that was very insightful. I haven't really ever thought about it that way. That it was the Genesis. It laid forth the principles for the first time. Okay, Jeanette, do you have a question? Our Director of Operations?
Yeah, question and a little bit of trivia. Mary Catherine Goddard, what do you know about her? It's rumored that when she was a publisher in in Baltimore, and that when she was at that time, they didn't have social media. So of course we had to get the word out that they've made this declaration and everybody has to sign it. So is it true that when she published them, along with all these signatories' names, she placed her own name? And so for quite a while in history, there was a story that didn't she really sign it? From what I read, I understood. Do you know anything? Is that true that she added her name later and that for many years people thought that she was a signature?
Yeah, I'm just going to plead ignorance because I just don't know enough about the story, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I just can't really say either way.
Have you ever heard, though, of the story of a woman being a signature and it getting lost in history?
Yeah, it was really the members of Congress who signed, and so I don't know if her name ended up on there some way, but I think that I generally like to just stick to the history and realize who signed it and who didn't sign it and the reasons why.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Jeanette, when did she supposedly sign it?
How did that? When she signed it. Well, the story was that when it got out, people were getting in Philadelphia and Baltimore and in the eastern cities, when they received their copies, her signature was on there with all the gentlemen. And so then a lot of people were saying, oh, they had a woman sign it, but then they were saying years later.
But was her signature there because she printed it?
Her father was a printer. Her father had a printing press and she worked there. And supposedly in 77, Congress asked that many copies of the Declaration be published for distribution.
So she put her name on it as a publisher, so to speak, like HarperCollins Books.
Well, that's what they were saying, that she put her name in with the signatories.
Okay. Well, she wasn't there in Congress.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's muddled history.
Lisa, it's kind of interesting. Lisa, do you have a quick question? I want to see if we can get back to Cathy and Tova and Dakare.
Sure. I wanted to ask, Janine brought up that the Declaration of Independence was had to be signed unanimously by the Congress at the time, and I was curious how difficult of a process that actually was in terms of getting everybody to be on the same page there.
Yeah, so the document had to be unanimous for exactly those reasons. A 7-6 vote just wouldn't cut it, right? Or whatever number. It had to be a unanimous reflection of all the individual colonies and representative of all the peoples of those colonies. And as it says, it's an expression of the United Colonies of America. And so, for those reasons, even though there wasn't unanimity, even within the very halls of the Continental Congress in writing this, in fact, there's a titanic debate about the resolution for independence that Richard Henry Lee from Virginia had introduced back on June 7th. And that debate after the Declaration is written, the debate over independence is really the debate over that resolution. And that really takes place on July 1st and then a little bit into July 2nd when that resolution is adopted. And John Adams very humorously and very famously writes Abigail and tells her, July 2nd is going to be the day we celebrate independence forever, and we're going to have fireworks and illuminations, and everyone's going to celebrate that day. In the next few subsequent days is when the Declaration of Independence itself was not only discussed, but it was also edited as well, about 25% of it, and then that was adopted on July 4th. And so that unanimity is very important for understanding that there was even a debate between John Adams and John Dickinson and their respective allies on July 1st. So, you know, and so that is, I think, representative of the fact that there wasn't really even unanimity in the country at large. And still yet there was, as I mentioned earlier, that deliberative process, that debate over independence.
They were able to pull it together. And Tony, Lisa, you obviously haven't watched 1776, the movie. So you must watch 1776, the musical. It was done in the 70s. It's the best John Adams acting. Dakare, you would, as an actor, he's just phenomenal as John Adams. He's really represents what John Adams was like. So watch that, Lisa. But what Tony touched on is that they hated John Adams because John Adams was really fighting for the Declaration of Independence. He really believed in it, and everyone would just tell him to shut up and to sit down, and he was just despised. So he wanted to put forth the resolution. But he knew if he did it as a Boston, Massachusetts, Northeastern, that no one would go for it. So he picked Richard Henry Lee to actually go back home to his state, get the actual votes for the resolution, and that Richard Henry Lee from the South would bring it forth for a vote. And so it was a political move, a great political move on John Adams' part, to have Virginia actually put forth the resolution for independence, because he knew if John Adams did, nobody would go for it because they just didn't. Yet he was the thorn in everybody's side that made this happen. And also it was John Adams' idea to have a Virginian actually write the Declaration of Independence. There was a commission. I think Benjamin Franklin was on it. John Adams was on it, and then it was John Adams as well that picked Washington to be the general. So we can thank John Adams for a lot of things. But it's like, my name is Richard Henry Lee, Virginia is my home. Have you seen it, Tony?
Yes. I used to show it to my students when I was a teacher.
Yeah, my fifth grade teacher, we put 1776. He cast us in these roles, and the entire year we rehearsed the play 1776, and then we actually performed it at the end of the school year. And for all the educators out there, just to bring the arts in to teach someone and to utilize this play, it has had an everlasting impact on me. It's really amazing. But New York abstained courteously. New York, to ask whoever asked this original question, I think Lisa did. New York kept saying, well, we abstained courteously. They just didn't want to get involved in anything. So I know they were a problem. And Caesar Rodney, who had to sign it, and where was he from? Caesar Rodney, was he from Delaware? Somebody look it up really quickly. I think they must have had a problem with, Delaware. Caesar Rodney was from Delaware, and Delaware wasn't really going for it, Lisa, to answer your question. And they had to have Caesar Rodney's signature, who he was horribly sick, dying of cancer. So, but I guess the other two were debating. One was for it, one was against it. So they had to have the tie vote of Caesar Rodney. So they brought Caesar Rodney in on like an ambulatory, they carried him in on a bed to do the vote because he was so sick. So there's some trivia there of the behind the scenes that was going on. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left. I would like Cathy, Tova, and Dakare to ask a very quick question. And Tony, if you just make the answers, this is kind of like the lightning round, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Cathy, go ahead.
Okay, Tony, you're obviously doing a lot of research on the Declaration of Independence. What has been your biggest surprise so far that you found out while writing your book?
Yeah, well, since I'm looking at it throughout history, I'm surprised just how much, it's been central to a lot of our debates, even over things like the Spanish-American War, whether we should be an imperialist power or not. Obviously it was heavily rooted in the debates around the Civil War, and even during World War II was used by FDR in many ways to appeal to those ideals against fascism. So I think just the ways it's been used for different debates, and that we keep coming back to it as sort of the central marker of who we are as a people and informing our current debates.
I love that, how we keep coming back to it.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we need to educate. That's why we really need to educate our youth about the United States Constitution, but also the Declaration of Independence, because we have another movement that's as ominous as fascism, which is communism and Marxism and socialism that's trying to take over the country, and you lose the rights in the Declaration of Independence when that happens. Dakare, I'm going to give Tova the last question. Dakare?
Okay, mine has nothing to do with the Declaration of Independence, but like all to do with Hamilton. So I see you've written some books about Hamilton.
I have.
Are you going to be watching Hamilton on Disney Plus on July 3rd?
Yes, and my wife we went to see it over Christmas, and yeah, it was spectacular. I loved
Awesome.
every minute of it. Yes,
Awesome.
I think it's great that so many young people are really getting interested in the founders and our nation's history and our founding through this brilliant musical. It's
Awesome.
great to see.
And do you think that it's a good like representation of Hamilton and everything that was going on during that time?
I do. I mean, you can quibble about this or that, and you can read different blog posts I've done and Steve Knott has done, who wrote Washington and Hamilton with me. But, you know, in general, we love it, and we think it's a great tool for young people to become really interested in history. I mean, I talk to so many young people who just memorize every line. They listen to it 1,200 times. They've gone to see it 8 times because they're very lucky. And it's just been a real phenomenon. And young people with me at my book signings and my talks around the country, they want to sit around and talk about Hamilton for 45 minutes, which
See, that's the power of the arts. That's the power of the culture and the power of the arts. Right. And once people know about Hamilton through the arts and it can finally make its way into the culture, they go, oh, they really did have some cool things to say. They really were interesting. But now if you say founding fathers, you seem antiquated or, you know, old fashioned, and people don't realize how fundamentally brilliant they all were. And so the arts, and getting involved in the culture, that's what we try to do at Constituting America. But that's what I just said, my teacher, Mr. Ingram, you know, 5th grade. Okay, Tova, last question.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what happened leading up to the Declaration of Independence, but could you talk about what happened in kind of the immediate aftermath? Like, what was the reaction of, first of all, what was the reaction of the American people, but also, what was the reaction of the British, like, government and also the British people? Did this drum up any support for the Americans overseas?
All right, good questions. I'll try to do it in a nutshell. You know, I think it did increase unity. I think it gave voice to that war for independence. You know, as I think Cathy or Janine said, it was read to the troops and really inspired them. And I think in many ways, you know, they fought for the very ideals that dripped from those pages, right? That they were fighting for liberty and equality and consent. And they took these principles seriously. And they fought and shed their blood and gave their lives for these ideals. You know, the reaction in Great Britain was relatively predictable. I mean, there were a few allies of America, but in general, you know, King and Parliament, for the most part, rejected the Declaration and, you know, continued to send troops there. And so that war continued until 1783. When the peace treaty was finally signed, to establish not only independence as a nation, but to establish a government and a country rooted upon an idea, a set of ideals, rather than just kind of, you know, nationalism as was done, or what Hamilton called force or accident is usually how governments were set up.
I was going to say something about that, but then my dog distracted me. What was your question, Tova?
It was about the immediate aftermath of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, yeah. I think there were a few people, I don't know their names, in Britain who said, you better not underestimate these folks. You know, you better watch out. Look at what they've accomplished over there. You know, they're part of our brethren. You know, you better watch out what these people are capable of it. And the king just wanted to hear nothing of it. Well, let's see. We have 60 seconds. Who wants the final question? Or to say something. Do we have a question from a listener? Cathy? Can't hear you.
Professor Klinger asked that in the debate in the Continental Congress, was most of the attention devoted to the first two paragraphs, which are mostly philosophical, or was more of the focus on the long list of specific complaints that the colonists had regarding the errors of omission and commission by the British Empire?
Right. Yeah. No, I do think it was the latter. I think the philosophical parts, you know, most of them agreed with, and they did want a self-government rooted upon liberty and consent and natural rights and so forth. And, you know, with some of the specific charges against the king that people are like, well, you know, especially when Jefferson blamed like the slave trade on the king, which was a pretty ridiculous thing. I mean, the Americans were sort of knee deep in that. And so they took that out. So it is largely, those parts that were debated, but then there were some stylistic changes made throughout the document as well.
Yes, there were. Am I muted? Even within the first two paragraphs, Thomas Jefferson had to sit back there while they just scratched a word, and debated the word over and over and over. Even life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I think that was one of the things that they tweaked. And so that's all. This is all in the musical 1776. But if you sit there and he had to just sit there and take it while they just absolutely nitpicked because it's not a lot of words. You know, it's not a huge document, and he sat there for a day or two while they just did, you know, continue to nitpick.
You didn't take it too well either. And Benjamin Franklin had to lean over and tell him a nice little vignette, a nice little story to kind of appease him a little bit and make him feel better. But yeah, like any writer, he didn't like really anyone editing his work. So.
So shall we close with the famous line that Benjamin Franklin said? I don't know it exactly. After everything was signed, and you know, it's so great in the musical because the bell rings and everything as everyone's signing. It's very dramatic. I'd love to see the play live on stage. It was originally a stage play. But Benjamin Franklin says, surely we will all hang separately, we all hang together. Who knows the exact quote? Tony, surely you do.
Yeah, we must all hang together. In other words, stick together, be united, or we will hang separately. In other words, as traitors on the gallows.
That's right. Or we will. Yeah, that's it. So everyone had to stick together. Unity. Tony Williams, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Janine, and thanks to all our young students who are with us. I wish you all the best.
Well, we're going to look out for all your books. Is it Tony Williams? What's your website?
They can find me on Amazon or Tony Williams on Twitter or Facebook. Search for me and
all right, very good. The oh so fabulous Tony Williams.